We're dealing with so many different topics when it comes to the economy, inflation, tariffs, egg prices, the stock market. Okay, loosely connected to the economy, but all of this matters. How do we make this make sense? Well, turns out I got a guy for that, and he's joining us next. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News. Stock market analyst and investor, and a good friend of mine, Guy Adami, has watched many different stock market cycles and many different economic cycles. And I called him very early on Wednesday morning asking if he would join us just to work through a couple of the things that we've heard from President Trump over the last several days when it comes to tariffs and what's next when it comes to the US economy. With so much going on with the economy right now, Guy, you got the stock market, you got inflation, you got tariffs, you got all this economic data that's showing us, like telling us a different story about the American
hmm
economy. What stands out most to you? Like what seems different about the times that we're in now compared to other periods that you've watched the stock market or watched the economy evolve?
Well, what's fascinating, Jen, it's always great to be on with you. You know, I'm a huge fan of your work and I admire you a great deal. You know, what's different is sort of this we're being inundated with all these different news cycles and different bits and pieces of news, and they all are having impact on my world being the economy and the stock market. And what I find fascinating is there's was so much optimism going into this administration, and now seemingly that optimism is waning a bit, and we're seeing it in a number of different ways. We're seeing it sort of consumer sentiment, which recently has been lower, unsurprisingly lower. And we're also seeing it with the bond market. And I don't want to get too wonky here, but 10-year yields, which went up to 4.8% a couple months ago, traded as low as 4.1% recently. And typically, what that means with rates falling is there's a slowdown in the economy. So the bond market is telling a story, consumer sentiment is telling a story. But on the flip side of the equation, despite the fact that the stock market has sold off recently, you still have these equity markets effectively at all-time highs.
So, what is the market responding to when we're seeing this? You have kids, Guy. You know that game like red light, green light
Yeah,
that
one,
you
two,
play with them.
three.
Period. That's right. Hey, it's always a tough one. It's easy to get lost in one of those games. But this conversation over tariffs is sort of like that. Okay, there's tariffs. Wait, there's not tariffs. Now there's really going to be tariffs, but maybe there's not going to be tariffs. For the markets, when we see those huge fluctuations,
Right.
what are investors making of all of this, and how is that impacting us even if we're not playing the stock market every single day?
Well, we're seeing it today, Jenna, and today being Wednesday, the stock market at one point today was significantly lower, and then it rallied a few hours ago on the back of this headline that came out that auto tariffs were going to be pushed off. And, you talk about investors, and you're right to talk about investors, but in the world we live in today, so much of the activity is driven by computer generated buy or sell orders. So a lot of it is predicated on the headlines that they're reading. And that's either a very good thing or very bad thing. In terms of how it impacts us, inflation is still a problem. Again, this administration inherited a bad inflation problem. Some will make the argument that inflation was set in motion with the prior administration. It's not politics, it's just the way people look at things. But the reality for most people is they were hoping for significantly lower prices, and maybe they'll still get them. But right now, they're seeing sort of the opposite. And I think people get frustrated very quickly. My point is, I think the honeymoon period these days is a lot shorter than it used to be.
What will actually impact consumer prices, Guy?
Well, supply demand. There's this old saying in the commodities world: the basically the salve, the cure for higher prices are higher prices. And I don't say that to be glib or to be a wise guy. What it basically means is prices will get to a level where people just sort of back away. And I don't think we've gotten there yet. Unfortunately, what I think what's happening is for most of the things that the prices have gone up, they're necessities, and necessities in terms of shelter, necessities in terms of energy, and obviously necessities in terms of food. That's what people are struggling with. So for a lot of people, the decisions they're making are predicated on, how much am I paying for that dozen of eggs or that gallon of milk or that gallon of gas or those types of things, and where does my rent play into this? And people have struggled with that for the last 4 years under a prior administration. And at least for the first month or so of this one, the struggle is still real.
I was thinking back to my financial news days and chasing the price of gasoline, and it feels like the price of a dozen eggs is the new
Yeah.
gallon of gas. That's what we're really tracking. It gives you a feeling about what's going on with the economy. The president mentioned something during his address to Congress. He said, there might be little disturbances.
Hmm.
Little disturbances. When I think of little disturbances, I don't even know what to really imagine with that. When you hear little disturbances based on tariffs or based on what this new administration is trying to achieve, what does that mean to you? What do you foresee for the markets? What do you see for your average American citizen?
Yeah, I think he's specifically, and I don't know this, but in my opinion, is he's specifically talking about the stock market in terms of disturbances. And I think he's seen that over the last month and a half. So again, without getting too wonky for your audience, the S&P 500, which is the benchmark that we all look at, was basically 5,700 on the day of the election. From there, the stock market went up in a very significant way, as you all know, but we've round tripped it. What does that mean? Well, we went from 5,700 to 6,100 and change back to 5,700. And I think in the president's mind, that's sort of the barometer. That's the benchmark. That's where his administration started. And I think he wants to be very careful not to have it fall too much lower than that. So when he talks about little disturbances, I think it's through the lens of the stock market. I think he's exquisitely focused on that. If you recall, in the first administration, he talked about the stock market being a report card for how well his administration is doing. So I think he continues to be laser focused on that.
Let me just ask you a question about tariffs, though. I was looking at the Wall Street Journal. I was trying to look for balanced opinions about tariffs, whether it's good to put tariffs in place to not good to put tariffs in place. A lot of the information is very critical about the tariffs that the president is putting forward. And the Wall Street Journal says, listen, tariffs are taxes. That's the only way to look at it. That's the only way it's going to impact the American consumer. Do you see it that way? How do you think of the multiple sides of this story about whether or not tariffs can achieve something for the U.S. economy or not?
Yeah, I think this is a multifaceted question, and I think the truth lies in a myriad of different answers. I think in a very elementary level, tariffs are taxes, but I think if you start to peel back the onion, you say, you know what? Maybe tariffs are a bargaining chip or a negotiating ploy, and maybe in order to get that playing field level, by the way, a playing field that's probably been tilted against us for many, many years, you need to sort of use this big stick. So I do think there's going to be some price pressures for people. I think they're going to have to sort of understand that the first part of this equation, almost by definition, will mean prices will go up. But I think at a certain point, you'll find this equilibrium and things will sort of manage themselves out and we can get to the other side of the mountain. The question is, and I think this is really important, how much pain tolerance do people have and how much time are they willing to give it? And unfortunately, in the world we live in, I think the answer is not so much on either of those two different metrics.
Yeah, well, and we can online shop in a second. You can Amazon yourself, whatever you want in a couple hours, right, guys? So the idea that you have to wait through something is tough. Okay, final
Nobody
question
wants
for you.
to see. Well, that's it. Nobody wants.
Yes.
We are a society where it's immediate gratification. Nobody wants to wait, and unfortunately, nobody wants to go through, in some ways, the suffering that's necessary to get to the other side. I mean, your husband will talk about this, and I know you're familiar with it. I mean, the other side of suffering is excellence, or is this sort of this next level of enlightenment that everybody wants to get to, but nobody's really willing to pay the price to get there.
Well, what you're bringing up is mission planning. If we
Yeah.
understand what the goal is, and if the goal is make America great again or make Americans more prosperous again, there needs to be a very clear image of what that is so everyone knows what they're working for and what's worth the sacrifice. And that's really the question here is like, what does success look like in this environment? What does a really great economy in America? What's the potential for the economy?
Yeah.
That's, it's almost hard to imagine like, well, what are we working towards? So with that in mind, Guy, just a final question, like, what are you watching with so much coming at you? You've been through so many different economic cycles. I'm not trying to make you sound old, but you and I both have been through a lot of economic cycles, right?
No,
We've seen
true.
a lot of different things. So what are you watching these days to tell you something about what direction we're headed, whether we're in the right direction, the wrong direction, or maybe you're just watching something completely different to give you some insight into what's happening with the country right now? Like what catches your mind?
I think that's a great question. And what concerns me, and this is non-political, this is this administration, prior administration, but what's been happening in this country now for the last 10 years or so, this chasm between the have and the have-nots continues to grow. And, for, I would say, 25 to 40 million of our fellow citizens, they have to make decisions based on, am I going to pay the rent this month, or am I going to feed my kids? And I'm not being hyperbolic. I mean, that's true. And on the flip side of that coin, the wealth that's been created on the other side is unprecedented. People in the middle typically get squeezed, and I think that's what we're seeing. One of the metrics that concerns me a great deal is now household debt in this country is north of $18 trillion. Credit card debt just made a record of $1.2 trillion. And I'm sure you speak about this on your shows. The average rate on those credit cards is approaching 23%. And by the way, that really has nothing to do with where interest rates go. I mean, those are based on what the banks are basically able to charge. That is concerning. And what I think is happening here, Jenna, is people are combating inflation with credit. And that is never a good, that's never really a good way to do things. It leads to bad outcomes. So I'm going to continue to watch that. Obviously, going to continue to watch what the stock market is doing. And then around the surface, watch things sort of on the credit side of things, which has not been a problem, but typically can become one without people realizing it.
That's really insightful, Guy. I haven't thought about that part of the equation, and it's an important one. So thank you for bringing it up. I feel like we're in like one of those Wall Street movies, by the way, because you're on your phone, and I feel like it's kind of like it's working for us.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like we're in the we're not in the trading pits anymore, Guy, but it kind of feels that way. So I appreciate it.
Well, Jenny, I think the world of you, and your audience is lucky to have you, and I mean that sincerely. So Smarter News, I know a lot of people that listen to you religiously and value what you do. So thank you, Jenna.